March 17, 1954. 7:42 p.m. Cambridge, Massachusetts. The corridor outside the laboratory is nearly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of warm dust and metal. Inside room E23 at MIT's instrumentation laboratory, a young research subject sits alone at a steel desk bolted to the floor. A single lamp hangs overhead, casting a tight circle of light. Beyond that circle, the room dissolves into shadow. On the wall in front of him, a small red indicator light glows steadily. Recording active. He adjusts his posture, not consciously, not fully, his shoulders square, his breathing slows, his hands rest neatly on the table. Even now, even alone, his body knows how to behave. Somewhere behind the one-way glass, technicians watch, clipboards in hand, headphones on, reel-to-reel tape machines turning softly, capturing every hesitation, every micro-movement, every silence between answers. He's been here for 43 minutes. Answering questions, solving abstract problems, sitting with nothing to do while knowing, feeling that he is being observed. Then without ceremony, the red light goes dark. No announcement. No explanation. Just a soft mechanical click from the control room. The subject notices immediately. Not because anyone told him, but because something inside him loosens, then tightens again in a different way. His eyes flick to the wall, he waits, nothing happens. No voice in the intercom. No instruction to continue. No reassurance that someone is still there. For the first time since entering the room, there is no witness. You might expect relief. That's what the researchers expected. They had designed this phase of the study around a simple assumption: remove surveillance and the subject would relax. Performance anxiety would drop, authentic behavior would emerge, the body freed from the gaze would finally exhale. But that's not what happened. The subject doesn't slump. He doesn't smile. He doesn't stretch or lean back. Instead, his hands slowly curl into loose fists. He shifts in his chair, then stills again. His eyes lose focus, drifting just past the desk, just past the wall. Minutes pass. The technicians exchange glances behind the glass. One of them notes the time, another adjusts the audio levels just in case. They're still recording. But the subject doesn't know that. From his perspective, the room has gone blank. No audience. No feedback. No confirmation that his presence matters to anyone at all. And something subtle, almost imperceptible, begins to surface. It isn't panic. It isn't fear. It's tension, but not the kind that comes from being watched. It's the tension of having nowhere to place yourself. In earlier phases of the experiment, the subject's behavior had been precise, measured, cooperative. Even when tasks were difficult, there was a rhythm to his engagement, as if he were in quiet conversation with an invisible other. A nod here, a pause there, small gestures shaped by the assumption of response. Now, without that assumption, the rhythm collapses. He scratches his forearm, stops. Clears his throat, stops. Leans forward as if to speak, then remembers there's no one listening. You can almost feel it, the moment when action no longer knows for whom it is being performed. The researchers would later describe this phase using neutral language: behavioral drift, latency increase, loss of task orientation. But in the room itself, what unfolds feels more personal than procedural. The subject isn't free. He's unanchored. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the psyche confronts an uncomfortable truth. Much of what we call self is organized around being seen, not admired, not judged, simply witnessed. When that witness disappears, something unresolved steps forward to take its place. The subject finally stands up, walks 2 steps, stops again. He looks toward the one-way glass, not with suspicion but with a kind of quiet expectation, as if waiting for confirmation that he still exists in someone else's awareness. Nothing. The glass reflects only his own outline. For the first time since the study began, he sits back down, not because he was told to, but because standing no longer feels meaningful. This is the detail that startled the researchers most. Not agitation. Not rebellion. But a flattening. A loss of intentionality. As if behavior itself had been borrowing energy from the gaze, and now that energy had vanished. Later interviews would reveal something even stranger. When asked how they felt during the unrecorded phase, several subjects struggled to answer. They didn't describe relief or anxiety or boredom. They described a blankness. One man used the word exposed, then corrected himself. No, he said, not exposed, unheld. That word never made it into the final report. But it lingered in the margins of the study, in handwritten notes, in conversations that happened after hours when the machines were shut off and the building went quiet. Because the implication was unsettling. If surveillance creates pressure, it also creates structure. If attention weighs on us, it also gives shape. And when that weight disappears, what remains isn't always freedom. Sometimes it's a question the psyche has been postponing for years. If no one is watching, who is this all for? The subject glances once more at the dark indicator light. Then he closes his eyes. Not to rest, but as if listening for something that should be there and isn't. Behind the glass, one of the technicians reaches toward the switch. Hesitates. And decides to wait. Because whatever is happening in that room now, it wasn't part of the original design. The red light stays dark. 5 minutes. Then 10. Inside room E23, the air feels thicker, not because anything has changed physically, but because nothing is arriving from the outside anymore. No cue, no correction, no acknowledgement that time itself is being tracked. The subject opens his eyes. At first, he resumes small movements as if testing the room. He taps the edge of the desk once. The sound lands heavily, unreturned. He shifts his weight, crosses one ankle over the other, uncrosses it again. Each gesture seems to ask a quiet question. Is this still happening? In the control room, the researchers debate protocol. According to the plan, the subject is meant to remain unobserved for 15 minutes before the recording resumes, but something about his stillness unsettles them. One technician suggests ending the phase early. Another shakes his head. Let it run. Because what they're not seeing doesn't look like stress. It looks like a system waiting for a signal that no longer exists. Earlier in the study, the subject's behavior had been consistent with expectations. When asked to perform cognitive tasks, he leaned forward. When confused, he frowned. When confident, he nodded slightly, as if checking his answers against an invisible standard. Now, without that standard, his face smooths into something harder to read. Not calm. Not tense. Neutral in a way that feels unfinished. From a Jungian perspective, the psyche often organizes itself around an inner witness long before we're aware of it. That witness is shaped early by parents, teachers, peers, institutions, and eventually internalized. We act as though someone is always watching, even when no one is. Especially then. But this room is doing something unusual. It isn't replacing the outer gaze with an inner one, it's removing both at once. And the psyche doesn't rush to fill the gap. The subject reaches into his jacket pocket, pulls out nothing, then slowly places his hands flat on his thighs. He stares at the floor. The seconds stretch. When the 15-minute mark passes, no one moves to flip the switch. Because the technicians have noticed a pattern, one that doesn't show up on charts. When observation ends, subjects don't become more themselves. They become less oriented. One researcher writes a note in the margin of his logbook. Behavior appears suspended without audience. Suspended. As if identity itself were briefly paused. The subject exhales long and slow, but it isn't relief. It's the kind of breath you take when you realize there's no next instruction coming. You can almost feel the internal recalibration beginning. Without a witness, action no longer carries symbolic weight. There's no one to impress, no one to resist, no one to disappoint, and without those reference points, motivation loses its usual hooks. The subject looks up again, this time directly at the one-way glass. Not searching. Waiting. In later interviews, subjects would describe this moment as strangely intimate, not lonely, exposed to oneself in a way that felt unfamiliar. One man compared it to speaking aloud and realizing there's no echo. Your voice leaves your mouth and doesn't come back. From the control room, the lead researcher finally gives the signal. The red light flickers on. Recording resumes. Instantly the subject straightens. His shoulders rise, his jaw sets, his gaze sharpens. The shift is immediate and unmistakable. It's as if someone just walked back into the room. He resumes movement, purpose returns to his hands. He clears his throat, ready to speak even before a question is asked. The body remembers what to do when it is seen. The researchers exchange looks. This is the data they were expecting: measurable, reproducible, easy to explain. And yet, none of them can forget what happened in the dark interval. Because something else had been revealed, something the instruments weren't designed to capture. The subject had not relaxed without surveillance. He had dimmed, as if attention were not merely a pressure, but a source of illumination. From a Jungian perspective, this raises an uncomfortable possibility that much of what we experience as freedom is actually structured by response. That being observed, even imperfectly, gives the psyche edges, contours, definition. Remove the gaze and the self doesn't expand. It blurs. In the days that follow, similar patterns emerge across subjects: different personalities, different backgrounds, same response. No euphoria. No rebellion. No authentic self bursting forth. Instead, hesitation, flattening, loss of initiative. One subject asks after his session ends, "Was I supposed to be doing something?" The question isn't logistical. It's existential. The researchers publish their findings carefully. They frame the results as limitations of experimental design, as evidence of task dependency, as artifacts of artificial settings. They do not speculate. They do not write about the feeling in the room when the light went dark. They do not write about how, for a brief window, the human psyche seemed unsure whether it existed without confirmation. But the implication lingers. If being watched is not merely a burden but a stabilizing force, then what happens when the watching stops in real life? Not abruptly, not dramatically, but slowly. When the audience thins, when the feedback fades, when no one is checking in anymore. Does the self feel free? Or does it quietly begin to ask a question it has never needed to answer before? Who holds this now? The subject leaves the lab that night with no sense that anything unusual has occurred. He signs the release forms, collects his coat, steps out into the cold Cambridge air. But the experiment doesn't end in the building. Because the next morning, several subjects report the same thing, unprompted. A strange difficulty getting started. A reluctance to act unless someone else was involved. Not sadness. Not fear. Just friction. As if the inner machinery had briefly tasted a world without witnesses and hadn't yet decided how to operate there. And that question, unanswered in 1954, has been following people quietly ever since. The reports come in quietly. Not to the newspapers. Not to the journals. They arrive as offhand remarks during follow-up interviews, as pauses that stretch a little too long before an answer forms, as phrases the researchers don't know how to code. I felt unfinished. It was like the room forgot me. I didn't know where to put my attention. None of this fits cleanly into the language of Cold War behavioral science. The official frameworks of the 1950s assume a simple exchange: stimulus and response, observation and performance. Remove the observer and the subject should revert to some truer baseline, a self beneath the posture. But the baseline never appears. Instead, the researchers at MIT's instrumentation laboratory notice something subtler and more unsettling. When the external gaze is removed, an internal one does not automatically take its place. The psyche hesitates. From a Jungian perspective, the inner witness is not a given. It is developed over time, shaped through relationship, mirroring, and recognition. It forms when the psyche learns to hold itself in awareness without requiring constant confirmation from outside. But what happens when that development is incomplete? The laboratory becomes an accidental test of that question. In room E23, the subject had not panicked, he had not dissociated, he had simply paused, as if waiting for an instruction that never came. The researchers begin to suspect that observation does more than create pressure. It provides orientation. It tells the psyche where it is located in relation to something else. Without that reference point, the subject didn't turn inward. He stalled. This becomes clearer during a later phase of the study, one that was never meant to be psychologically significant. Subjects are asked to sit alone in the room again, this time with the knowledge that no recording is taking place. The researchers make this explicit. The red light is covered with a piece of black tape. No one is watching, a voice says over the intercom, just wait. The intention is transparency, ethical clarity. The effect is almost worse. One subject begins packing in slow, uneven steps, stopping at irregular intervals as if he's forgotten where he intended to go. Another sits motionless for the entire duration, eyes open, unblinking. When asked afterward what they were thinking about, several struggle to answer. Nothing, one says. Too many things, another corrects himself. Neither feels accurate. You can almost feel the tension here, not dramatic, not painful, but unresolved, like a sentence that never finds its verb. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when persona collapses before the self has fully consolidated. The outer mask is gone, but the inner center has not yet been claimed. And in that gap, the psyche doesn't rush forward. It waits. The researchers notice something else too. Subjects who report strong internal narratives, men who describe themselves as self-directed, principled, internally motivated, show less disruption during the unobserved phases. They still hesitate, but they don't flatten. Others, equally intelligent, equally capable, show pronounced drift. Not because they lack identity, but because their identity has been largely shaped in response. Response to expectation. Response to evaluation. Response to being seen. The difference is not confidence. It's containment. The inner witness, it turns out, is not loud, it does not announce itself, it does not rush in to replace the outer gaze. It emerges slowly, often only after the psyche has endured periods of being unseen. In the lab, that endurance window is too short, 15 minutes, 30 at most. Just long enough to expose the absence. Not long enough to resolve it. And so the subjects leave carrying a residue they can't name. In the weeks following the study, several participants write back with comments unrelated to the experiment's stated goals. A man mentions difficulty starting tasks at work unless someone else is involved. Another describes an odd aversion to solitude, not loneliness, but a sense of disorientation when alone. One woman writes a single sentence in the margin of her follow-up form. I didn't realize how much I rely on being noticed. The researchers archive these notes. They do not include them in the final analysis. Because the Cold War is not a time for existential uncertainty, it is a time for clarity, control, predictability. Yet the irony is hard to miss. At the height of a surveillance-obsessed era, an experiment designed to measure behavior under observation accidentally reveals something else entirely. That the psyche may be less disturbed by being watched than by being unwatched. From a Jungian perspective, individuation is not the rejection of all gazes, it is the gradual replacement of external witnessing with internal presence. But replacement takes time. And until that internal presence is stable, the removal of attention does not feel like freedom. It feels like suspension, as if the self is briefly unmoored from the world. You can almost see it now, not in the lab but everywhere else. The moment an email receives no reply. The conversation that ends without acknowledgement. The project that goes unseen. The discomfort isn't about approval. It's about orientation. Without reflection, the psyche quietly asks, am I still in the room? The subjects at MIT eventually return to their lives, the study fades into the archives, the red lights are replaced, the equipment is upgraded. But the question the experiment uncovered does not expire. Because at some point, often later than expected, many people encounter the same moment. Not in a laboratory. Not with a technician behind the glass. But in ordinary life. When attention thins. When roles dissolve. When no one is checking anymore. And instead of relief, something else arrives. A pause. A waiting. A quiet realization that the inner witness has not yet taken its seat. And the psyche, left without an audience, must decide whether it can finally watch itself. The next section turns to what happens after that realization, when the silence doesn't end and the room stays empty long enough for something new to emerge. The silence doesn't break. Not in the laboratory. Not afterward. What follows is not a sudden insight, not a revelation that ties the experience into something clean and explainable. What follows is duration. Time with no audience. For the subjects, this isn't recorded in data points. It appears instead as small, delayed shifts, weeks later, sometimes months, when the initial disorientation gives way to something quieter and more demanding. They are no longer being watched. And this time no one comes back. One former subject describes it years later in a letter the researchers never asked for. He writes about sitting at his kitchen table after work, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, realizing there is nothing expected of him in that moment. No task, no response, no witness. I didn't feel free, he writes. I felt present, but I didn't know what to do with it. This is where the laboratory ends and the psychological work begins. From a Jungian perspective, the withdrawal of the outer gaze creates a vacuum only if the inner one has not yet been consciously assumed. The psyche, accustomed to orienting itself around response, must learn a new posture, remaining without performance. This does not feel triumphant. It feels unfinished. In the lab, 15 minutes of invisibility produced flattening. In life, longer stretches do something else. They force the psyche to either collapse inward or slowly consolidate. But consolidation is slow and uncomfortable. Without an audience, habits lose their urgency, gestures stop signaling, words begin to feel unnecessary. The self can no longer borrow energy from being seen. Something else has to supply it. This is the stage few people talk about. Not the loneliness of being ignored. Not the relief of being left alone. But the neutrality in between. You can almost feel it in the body, mornings without momentum, evenings without narrative, decisions that feel oddly weightless because no one will know you made them. Several former subjects report a similar phenomenon, a temporary drop in initiative, not from depression but from a loss of reference. I didn't know what counted, one writes. From a Jungian perspective, this is the psyche stepping out of relational gravity and discovering it cannot yet generate its own center of mass. That center, the self, is not constructed through intensity. It is assembled through repetition without reward, through attention that does not seek echo. In the lab, the subject closed his eyes as if listening for something that should be there. In life, the listening continues. Days pass. Then weeks. Slowly something shifts. One subject describes an afternoon where he begins cleaning his apartment, not because anyone is coming over, not because it feels productive, but because disorder has started to irritate him in a way it never did before. Another finds himself taking long walks without telling anyone where he's going. He doesn't post about it, doesn't narrate it. The walk is not a message. It is an experience with no recipient. This is the quiet emergence of the inner witness. Not as a voice, not as a judge, but as a presence that notices without reacting. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the psyche stops asking who will see this and begins asking something else. Does this feel aligned? The difference is subtle but absolute. Alignment does not seek applause. It does not demand validation. It does not rush. It simply registers congruence or the lack of it. In the laboratory, the absence of surveillance exposed the dependency. In life, extended absence offers an invitation. Not to withdraw, not to isolate, but to remain without an audience long enough for a different kind of coherence to form. This is why the moment of realizing no one is watching does not feel relieving. Relief belongs to endings. This is not an ending. It is a threshold. And thresholds are rarely comfortable. They ask something of you without explaining what comes next. The researchers at MIT could not have designed an experiment to capture this phase. It unfolds too slowly, too quietly, without measurable output. But it is the phase that determines whether invisibility becomes collapse or consolidation. When no one returns, do you disappear? Or do you stay? The room does not answer. The silence does not instruct. But if you remain long enough, something begins to organize itself, not around being seen, but around being true. Not true in a moral sense, true in a structural one. The psyche learns to hold itself. The final section turns to what this shift costs, and why, once it occurs, the return of attention never feels quite the same again. Because after you learn to exist without being watched, being seen becomes optional. Not meaningless, but no longer necessary. The change is quiet. So quiet that most people miss it when it happens. There is no moment of declaration, no sense of arrival, no internal announcement that the inner witness has taken its seat. Instead, there is a gradual reordering, one that only becomes visible in contrast. Former subjects from the MIT study describe it indirectly, often years later, when reflecting on periods of their lives that followed. They don't talk about the experiment itself, they talk about how attention began to feel different afterward. Compliments landed more softly. Criticism traveled less far. Silence no longer felt like erasure. One man describes giving a presentation at work and realizing mid-sentence that the room's reaction no longer mattered in the way it once had. Not because he was disengaged, but because something inside him was already holding the experience. I still cared, he says, I just wasn't leaning on them to tell me who I was. From a Jungian perspective, this is not detachment, it is differentiation. The psyche has developed enough internal structure to remain intact regardless of gaze. Attention can come or go without destabilizing the sense of self. But this shift carries a cost. Once the audience becomes optional, certain forms of energy disappear. Urgency fades. Performance sharpens less often. The thrill of being noticed loses its charge. Some describe this as a dulling, especially at first. A flattening of highs as well as lows, the emotional spikes that once provided momentum no longer arrive on cue. This can feel like loss. In truth, it is a trade. What is lost is reactivity. What is gained is coherence. The researchers never followed up on this phase, their funding cycles ended, their equipment was repurposed, their notes archived. But the pattern they stumbled into remains visible everywhere. In people who stop explaining themselves. In those who no longer correct misinterpretations. In individuals who can sit in silence without waiting for it to end. From a Jungian perspective, this is not withdrawal from the world, it is the end of dependency on reflection. The self no longer requires constant mirroring to remain present. And once this happens, something irreversible occurs. Being seen no longer defines existence. It becomes an addition, not a requirement. This is why when the audience returns, it feels different. Praise is appreciated, but not absorbed. Criticism is registered, but not internalized. Attention is noticed, but not chased. The psyche no longer organizes itself around response. It organizes itself around alignment. This is the quiet maturity most people don't recognize when they pass through it. There is no ceremony, no social reward, often no language for it at all. Just a subtle shift in posture. You stand a little differently in rooms. You speak a little slower. You choose words with less urgency. And when silence arrives, unexpected, uninvited, you no longer rush to fill it. Because the room is no longer empty. The witness is already there. This is what the MIT experiment accidentally illuminated, not in its data but in its absence. That the fear of being unwatched is not about invisibility. It is about incompletion. And that once the psyche learns to hold itself, the removal of the gaze does not create relief. It creates something far rarer. Stability. Not the loud kind. Not the performative kind. But the kind that remains when nothing is being recorded. When no one is keeping score. When the light goes dark and stays that way. And you do not disappear. You remain.